Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us tonight for the next chapter in our mini-series on imperialism. Tonight, we've got with us Mike Macnair. We've already mentioned him a couple of times when we were looking at Lenin and his much-studied book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Mike's got various criticisms of the book, and he'll be discussing them tonight, as well as contemporary imperialism, which is a big subject. So it's going to be a tour de force through these subjects. But thank you very much for joining us, Mike. He's going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we have time for questions and comments and discussion, of course. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, I'm speaking essentially to stuff which I have myself written, and I've just sent to Tina. I don't know. I hope she will be able to put it up in some way, a bunch of stuff. So the order of this material is not chronological of my writing, but chronological in relation to the history of the workers' movement's discussion of imperialism. So it starts with my introduction in Ben Lewis and Matsuri's translation of Karl Kautsky on colonialism in 2013, then a book review of Richard Day and Daniel Guido's book on imperialism, which it collects Second International debate on imperialism. Then another article of mine, Die Glocke, or the inversion of theory from anti-imperialism to pro-Germanism, on how a part of the anti-imperialist left became pro-German in August 1914. And then we jump back to a series of articles from 2004, which started with a polemic with the Alliance for Workers' Liberty about Iraq and, quote, new imperialism, and went on to two more articles on modern imperialism and a reply to critics in September 2004. And then more recently, though in fact it was written around about the same time, in the early 2000s, apart from the last part of it, a series of supplements, four-page supplements in the Weekly Worker in 2022, which is more depth on the relationship of imperialism and the political economy of the state. So my kickoff point is that basically the fundamental structural stuff of Lenin's imperialism. First place, it's not actually, most of it is not actually original in Lenin. The basic idea that imperialism arises because of overproduction, particularly overproduction in capital goods sectors, which leads to investment overseas. And this investment overseas leads to colonialism, and it's connected to overproduction and monopolization. Both monopolization and overproduction and colonialism are responses to overproduction. Now, this is not, in fact, original in Lenin. It's Ernest Belfort Bax writing about British imperialism in the late 19th century. It's then supplemented by Max Beer, whose work is again very late 19th century, whose work is in the Day and Guido book. Beer argued that there was a phase of anti-imperialism in British policy in the 1860s and 1870s, driven by the ascendancy of liberalism, and then a return to imperialism in the 1870s. Beer, I think, fairly fundamentally misunderstood what was going on in British politics at the time. He was, however, in Britain. Yeah. Then we get to Karl Kautsky, the collection of articles which Ben and Zuri translated, and which I wrote an introduction for. And Kautsky offers an alternative theory to Beer's, rather than imperialism resulting from capitalist overproduction. Imperialism results from the ascendancy of pre-capitalist classes in continental Europe, leading to the creation of extractive colonial regimes under the aegis of France, Russia, Germany, and the British then creating the British Empire as a defensive reaction to the creation of the French, German, etc. Empires. And then Bax's theory, however, that's Kautsky's theory, but Bax's theory is also maintained in slightly different form by Parvus, aka Alexander Gelfand, aka Israel Lazarovich something. We don't know what his actual Russian surname was. Gelfand is a pseudonym. Elephant was another version of it. Parvus was the one by which he's most famous. Parvus wrote about against the German naval expansion, contemporaneous with Kautsky, who's writing against German naval expansion. Parvus also wrote against Bernstein, who Bernstein argued for German humanitarian intervention against Turkey in the interests of the Armenians in 1896-97, which is the kickoff of the revisionism controversy. And Bax had previously proposed his overproduction theory of imperialism, but he reiterated it in the beginnings of the revisionism controversy, and Parvus adopted and developed it. Parvus is distinctive. He's not the only one, but he's one of the few Second International guys who actually held an economics degree. Well, not that that's necessarily a good thing to be the case, but it's sort of perhaps significant. He's quite good with figures and analysis of that sort. Then we move at the next stage into the Dan Guido book, because the Dan Guido book doesn't print anything before the revision, the 1900s. But it does print quite a lot of material, and it tells us basically that imperialism was an issue which was divided the left and the right of the SPD and of the Second International, that the right wing of the Second International was inclined towards humanitarian interventionism, was inclined to imagine imperialism as a progressive force, as a civilizing force, a line of argument which has been resurrected in our own time by the Alliance for Workers' Liberty and similar outfits. And these debates led to the episodes of high debate and low debate. So the first is, as I said, the debate, the revisionism controversy in Germany, a controversy about the German naval budget and whether Social Democrats should vote for the naval budget on the grounds that imperialism was historically progressive, which some of the right wing argued. The next stage is the Herero genocide in Southwest Africa, the campaigning of the Social Democrats against the Herero genocide, the war in Southwest Africa. Parvus wrote a full book. It's a savage book. Ben has translated it, but it isn't published. And the problem basically is that Dan Guido published the major theoretical sections of Parvus's book, but the excoriating exposure of the German genocide of the Herero people in Parvis's book isn't there. And the result of this was that there was a common front of the bourgeois parties against the social democracy, with the result that although the Social Democrats' votes went up in the 1906 election, their seats went down. And the right wing argued that in order to overcome the problem of the number of seats going down, it was necessary to have a, quote, constructive colonial policy. That is, a policy of reforming colonialism and not opposing colonialism outright, so that we get more of Parvis again, colonial policy and breakdown. This is, again, contains the Herero stuff. We get Karl Kautsky again, socialism and colonial policy, substantially softer than Parvis. We get Rosa Luxemburg intervening again. We get a number of other German authors intervening on the colonial question. And again, the issue arises yet again at the time of the Agadir incident in 1911, when there's a big war scare that war is expected, war is coming. Is war about to kick off now over the Germans attempting to protect the Moroccan state from being made into a neo-colony of France, which in fact it was made into a neo-colony of France because the Brits threatened war if the Germans intervened on the Moroccan side. Is the question which arises in the 1911-1912 debates is, could we have capitalism without imperialism, or is imperialism an inevitable and necessary stage in the development of capitalism? At this stage, we also get Hilferding's book, Finance Capital, and Hilferding connects the phenomenon of imperialism not just to overproduction and cartels, but also to the integration of banks and industry in the construction of monopolistic. Das Finanzkapital is for Hilferding and subsequently for Lenin, not what we would call financial capitalism, that is to say, the financial games players at arm's length operating through share markets, financial futures markets, and so on and so forth, but the integration of banks and industry, which remains actually characteristic of German and French industrial and financial organization. So my point then is, what Lenin is doing with imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is reasserting the orthodoxy of the left wing of the Second International, reflected in the ideas of Hilferding and others. He writes in a way, he places more emphasis on Hobson, liberal author Hobson. The reason for that is because the book is written carefully with a view to the censorship, with a view to being published. It isn't in fact published before the outbreak of the February Revolution, but with a view to being published before the February Revolution. That's reflected in, or we've got Lenin's notebooks on imperialism that he read for the purpose of writing Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, a lot of stuff which he didn't use, and which he didn't use because it would inevitably bring him into conflict with the Tsarist censorship, though probably also partly because he disagreed. Now, Lenin's book, in that sense, is a reassertion of orthodoxy, but it's not a reassertion of orthodoxy in another sense, which is that it's a polemic against, it contains an implied polemic, because it's written for the censorship. The polemic is not explicit. It contains an implied polemic against Nikolai Bukharin's Imperialism and World Economy, and against Rosa Luxemburg's book on imperialism, The Accumulation of Capital. Yeah. And the implied polemic is also against the arguments of Luxemburg and of Piatakov, Kollontai, Bukharin, the so-called imperialist economists, about the Easter Rising in Ireland, because and the Polish question, because the quote imperialist economists and Luxemburg argued that the effect of imperialism is that the question of self-determination of nations is wholly superseded, and nationalism is invariably reactionary, and that the Easter Rising was as reactionary as the war itself. And Lenin's argument is directed against features of Bukharin's imperialism and world economy. He denies Bukharin's claim that imperialism will lead to, quote, super imperialism. Now, this is different. Kautsky argued in 1914 that there could be an ultra imperialism, which would be a cartel consensually agreed between the major imperialist powers in which they didn't fight each other. This was Kautsky actually made himself look utterly stupid, because the World War I broke out very shortly after his ultra-imperialism article was published. Bukharin, on the other hand, argued that the conflict between the imperialist powers would inevitably lead to the victory of one of the imperialist powers, which would then dominate the others and hold them in subordination. And Lenin polemicizes against that. He says there can never be a single dominant imperialist power. Secondly, as I said, he polemicizes against the idea that the nationalism is wholly reactionary in the period of the imperialist competition. And thirdly, he polemicizes against, this is Bukharin rather than Luxemburg. Bukharin argues that because in the epoch of imperialism, competition between capitals mutates into competition between states. The result is that the working class as a class is drawn in behind its own state, and its working class attachment to the state, which is the basis of the phenomenon of social chauvinism, of the majority of the socialists backing their own states in the First World War. In contrast, Lenin argues, no, it's only the labor aristocracy and a small section of the labor bureaucracy which is bribed. And in Lenin's account, it's not bribed by the state, it's bribed directly by the capitalist class to come up with, to back the state. Okay. Now, on the basis of this stuff, actually, I think Lenin is systematically wrong. I'm not going to say about the national question, because it seems to me that there are perfectly good arguments other than the arguments of Lenin's imperialism in favor of the national question still being an important political issue, and in favor of anti-colonialism, in favor of Marx's argument that a nation that oppresses another can never itself be free, said by Marx and Engels about Ireland, Britain's relationship with Ireland. However, step one, it's not the highest stage. The phenomenon of imperialism is normal to capitalism. It begins with the Venetian Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Genoese Empire, also partly in the Eastern Mediterranean, but after Genoese defeat by Venice, moving into Genoese finance capital, operating slave-worked sugar colonies, sugar plantation colonies under the state aegis of Portugal and subsequently Spain. Secondly, there isn't a distinct stage of monopoly capitalism. This was wrong in Hilferding, and it's wrong in Lenin. The fusion of banks and industry, Hillel Tichtin showed back in the 1980s, that in reality the fusion of banks and industry is a phenomenon of early capitalism, not of late capitalism, so that British capitalism had fusion of banks and industry, of country banks and industry in the early 19th century, but the arm's length financial industry in the second half of the 19th century. American capitalism had fusion of banks and industry well into the 20th century and moved out of it as it became the world dominant power into the separation of finance and industry through the classic Anglo-American financial structure. Marx, in fact, demonstrates in Capital itself that full monopoly arrangements and cartels and so on and so forth are at the end of the day unstable. Now, what happens to some of them is that they become nationalized, which is what happened basically to the rail industry, which was the great cartel operation. But quite a lot what happens is they get smashed by external competition because the monopolist attempts to monopolize, but someone outside the system will destroy it. And we can see that the last stages of that with the Port Talbot Tata in the process of closing down Port Talbot Steel, but basically monopolized British industry, British steel industry, and equally US steel, fully monopolized, and then substantially driven, not completely, but substantially driven out of business by Far Eastern steel operators. And that's just what Marx said would happen, contrary to what Bax and Hilferding and Lenin said would happen. Thirdly, Buchanan was half right on super-imperialism. He was half right because it was the case that the upshot of the First and Second World Wars is the United States conquers the rest of the capitalist powers and holds them in subordination, as was visible in the Plaza Accord, that the United States could insist on Japan revaluing the yen and in consequence drive the Japanese industrial economy into a 40-year depression, which is still going on. In the same way that the rise of Europe can be wiped out by the United States through its Ukraine operation, forcing the Europeans to buy American-controlled fuels and not to buy oil and gas from Russia. But in fact, actually, what was the half which was wrong was that in reality, what predated the First World War was Britain having dominance at the same level that the United States, not quite as intense as the United States, but that Britain controlled until 1861-65. Britain controlled the United States through the slave power and the states' rights constitutionalism, blocking protective tariffs against Britain, blocking the development of a powerful US Navy and of US overseas colonies. The Civil War dislodged British control over the United States. Similarly, in Germany, Britain actively intervened to prevent German unification through the first half of the 19th century, and British active intervention against German unification was overcome in the 1860s by the Bismarck regime and so on. So the degree of it's very easy to underestimate the degree of British control in the 19th century and to imagine a sort of open competitive regime, and it isn't an open competitive regime. It's one which has a super imperialist power at the head of it, and pushed back into the golden century of Dutch capitalism in the 1600s. Then Dutch capitalism sat in charge of the world. And 1688 is a successful Dutch invasion of Britain, asked for by the British opposition, but nonetheless it's a Dutch conquest of Britain. And indeed, one of the triggers of 1640 is the Dutch systematically violating British territorial waters in order to destroy a Spanish fleet which had taken refuge in British territorial waters at the Battle of the Downs. And the British monarchy lacks any sort of fleet which could possibly go up against the Dutch fleet in the Battle of the Downs. And push back further than that, and it's the Venetian ducat, which is the reserve currency, so that there is a world hegemon power in any period of capitalist existence, and the world hegemon power is there because there needs to be a world reserve currency. For capitalism, there needs to be a world reserve currency. That reserve currency is the ducat, it's the guilder, and the bill on Amsterdam, and then it's the pound sterling and the bill on London, and then it becomes the dollar. Thirdly, Bukharin was right that it was not a question. The backing of the labor movement for the imperialist war was not a question of the direct bribery of the labor aristocracy. And indeed, the concept of the labor aristocracy as a reactionary section of the working class is deeply misleading. If we think about who became the vanguard of the class in the aftermath of 1918, it's the skilled workers, it's the rail workers, it's the miners, it's the engineers, and all of these people would have fallen into the category of, quote, labor aristocracy. Whereas on the other hand, Ernie Bevin's Transport and General Workers Union, which is the biggest and most important of the general workers unions, is the backbone of the right wing in the trade union movement. The loyalism of the working class loyalism is mediated through the state. And once we see that that Bukharin is right as against Lenin on the point that working class loyalism is mediated through the state, we can also see that we can have working class loyalism not only in imperialist countries, but also in colonial countries, because every state is located somewhere in a hierarchy in the world system. And there can be advantages for the Argentinian working class in gaining in the Argentinian state gaining an edge over Brazil or over Chile, just as there can be advantages for the British working class as British in the British state gaining an edge over France or Germany or the United States, etc., etc. So that's my starting point then, is that the Leninist theory that this is the highest stage of capitalism, that it's monopoly capitalism, that this is the driving force behind the First World War. In the first place, it's not entirely original from Lenin. Secondly, insofar as it's original for Lenin and a polemic against Bukharin and Luxembourg, it's probably not right. And that has a practical consequence that when the Comintern builds its theses on imperialism and the provisions of the 21 conditions, which commit the communist parties to standing for the victory of the national movement in the colonial countries, as opposed to standing merely for the defeat of the imperialists in relation to colonialism, actually that turns out to be not a workable policy for the communists in the colonial countries. And we can see this in the Turkish Communist Party, who are the leadership of which is sacrificed to the Soviet alliance with Kemal Ataturk in very early in the regime. But equally, we can see it in the inability of the Comintern to decide early enough on a break with the Kuomintang in China and the celebrated serious defeat of the Chinese communists in 1927. Okay, so that's on Lenin, as it were. And then the question which is posed is, how can we think about alternative ways of thinking about this? And I want to make a point. Several people have suggested in letters in response to what I've written that I think that it's all the same thing, pre-capitalist and capitalist. No, I don't. If I look at Imperium Romanum, the empire, the Roman Empire, that's a self-identified expression, and it's where the expression imperialism ultimately comes from. But it's socially, it's the same phenomenon of as the mandate of heaven in China. And what it signalizes is that the state, having gone beyond a city-state level, becomes an imperial state both the Roman Empire and the Chinese regime spread. They don't create a radical divergence between the different territories within the empire by which one part of the empire exploits the other. On the contrary, they spread identical relations of production. They spread villa economy in Western Europe. They spread urbanism, and indeed later the Roman Empire constructs wholly artificial cities in all sorts of places because it's built on cities. And the same is true of the Chinese empire, that it constructs artificial cities because it's built on a network of cities. You get uniform relations of production, forces and relations of production within the territory of the empire, within certain limits, but then a sharp gradient between the inside of the empire and the outside of the empire. That sharp gradient between the inside of the empire and the outside of the empire is expressed in the Great Wall of China, but is also expressed in the Roman limes constructed by Hadrian and so on. And at the end of the day, the boundary collapses and the barbarians come in across the borders. But that's nothing like capitalist imperialism. Similarly, in the Middle Ages, we have a social phenomenon which we can conveniently call colonization, which we can see in what's called the Drang nach Osten, the movement of Germans into the East, that the German peasants and aristocrats gradually move eastwards and eastwards and eastwards until they run up against the Czech kingdom, the Hungarian kingdom, the Polish kingdom, are able to reconstruct their kingdoms to hold off this tide of German peasant and aristocratic land hunger. And the same is true in England. The English tied into Wales, tied into southern Scotland, tied into Ireland. But at the end of the day, the Scots are able to build a kingdom. The Welsh wind up being conquered and subordinated to England. Ireland actually becomes sort of proto-colony. But they wouldn't have called that imperialism. What people in the Middle Ages would have called imperialism is the cult of the Holy Roman Empire, which is the empire founded when Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800 AD. Which loses France later on and becomes the Holy Roman Empire of the German people, but it also includes Italy, and it also includes what's now the Netherlands. And the idea of the imperial idea is an idea that there ought to be a universal monarchy. As an alternative to the other line of argument is that the Pope ought to be the universal monarchy. And we get in the Italian city-states parties called Guelphs, so called because they are partisans of the Welf dynasty which attached itself to the Pope and opposed the Hohenstaufen Roman emperors, and Ghibellines who supported the Hohenstaufen and the empire. So it's the emperor versus the Pope, but equally the emperor versus the King of France, the King of England, and so on and so forth. But that's, again, it's a very different, the social phenomenon of medieval colonization comes up against limits because basically the medieval military technology is artisanal, and it's easy enough for the King of Scots to create a kingdom which can stand off the English, as turns out to be the case between 1309 and 1603. Or for the Kingdom of Poland to create a kingdom which can stand off, and indeed the Kingdom of Poland becomes an enormously powerful Central and Eastern European kingdom in the later Middle Ages. So the difference is that capitalist imperialism, in my view, is essentially about a capitalist state holding another territory, which may or may not be capitalist, holding another territory in subordination and forcing the other territory to adapt the conditions of its economy to the service of the metropolitan economy. And that's just as much true, say, Venice. Later medieval Venice, as I said, sugar colonies on Crete and Cyprus worked by slaves, sugar plantations worked by slaves. The harvesting and the first stage of processing is dealt with in Crete or Cyprus, as the case may be. The final high value added stage of the sugar processing of the production of consumer sugar products is done in Venetian and Venetian terra firma. That's the Italian territories attached to Venice, and the proceeds, the profits are localized in Venice. So an imperialist state is going to be one which has its own financial operations. It can't do it if it's dependent on other people's financial operations, and is capable of, as a military actor and as a financial actor, of holding other territories in subordination so as to force the other territories to act as feeders. Now, feeders of what? The feeders, it can be the case that the feeders are feeding the metropolitan territory with raw materials. That's what's going on with the sugar plantation colonies. It can be the case, or for that matter, with North America's timber colonies, not plantation colonies, but it's colonies primarily designed to source timber, or the southern US states to source cotton for the British textile industry. Poland is a semi-colony of the Netherlands through the 17th century, which sources wheat for the Netherlands. But it can also equally be the case that the semi-colonial possession sources, well, for example, iPhones are sourced in East Asia, but the high value added stuff is the software construction, and the software construction and the marketing processes are centered in the United States. So it can perfectly well be the case that it's industrial production, but it's nonetheless industrial production which is under the control of and for the benefit of capital in the imperial power, which the capital in order for that to be the case, the capital in the imperial power has to have both military autonomy and financial autonomy. It won't work if it's subordinated itself. Secondly, the form of holding insubordination doesn't have to be the formal colonization. In fact, formal colonization is a peculiar feature of the 19th century, and where it comes from is that the British state and the French state fight over India in the mid to late 18th century, mainly through proxy wars that they have client regimes in the different parts of India. But the upshot of that set of proxy wars is that the British state captures the North Indian military labour market, which was a very large, enormous mass market of guys who sold themselves as soldiers. Originally sold themselves as soldiers for the Mughals or for the Maratha or for the Sikh states or for the various sultanates. But there was this enormous military labour market, and the British captured this North Indian military labour market and turned India into the first real territorial colony, as opposed to the plantation colonies and the settler colonial operations of one sort and another. And from India, we get British colonization of Malaysia. We get British colonization of South Africa. It's Indian troops who are deployed in British interest in the Gulf and to take Aden. And the characterization of Queen Victoria as the Queen Empress, the Queen of Britain and the Empress of India is a perfectly accurate characterization of the functioning of the British Empire. But then the British Empire, it's not a defensive institution. The British Empire operates a system of non-tariff barriers, not tariffs, protective tariffs, but non-tariff barriers, which have the effect that, say, for example, the Indians are made to pay for the budgetary costs of the British holding an army in India. And they have to pay for the budgetary costs of the British holding an army in India in sterling. And they can only earn sterling by exporting raw materials to Britain. So that this operation undermines the Indian textile industry and strengthens the British textile industry. This system of non-tariff barriers then forces the French and subsequently the Germans and to create their own tariff barriers and tariff protection. The United States, of course, is a colonial level operation, and they are unable to create tariffs until the Civil War overthrows the British control of the United States through the states' rights constitutionalism. The first thing, one of the very first things that the Union side do in the Civil War is to impose protective tariffs for American industry, which the Democrats have blocked forever beforehand. So the form can take the form of puppet governments, low-level interventions. It can take the form of offshore bases. Offshore bases, again, begin with the Venetian and Genoese states. As the United States has this enormous network of bases around the world, the UK still holds a significant number of offshore islands and remote bases of one sort or another, like Akrotiri in Cyprus and Gibraltar and so on. So the network of bases, strong-arming states, send a gunboat, famously Palmerston's message, lending to states, and Argentina, for example, was the wealthiest state in Latin America in the later 19th century, but then Barings Bank went bust in 1890 due to unwise speculation on the London stock market. And as a result of Barings Bank going bust, in order to bail out Barings Bank, all the loans to Argentina were not rolled over but called in instantly, with the result that the Argentinian railways became the property of the British creditors, etc., etc. Similarly, in Turkey, more or less the same period, the British and French called in the loans which had been made to the Turkish state, didn't roll over the loans which had been made to the Turkish state, and took over the entire Turkish tax apparatus as under creditor administration, which it continued to be under creditor administration until 1914, which was why Parvus argued for Turkey to join the German side in 1914. You will escape from what we would now call IMF structural adjustment programs. Okay, so the form of political control varies, but commonly involves forms of creditor control. The form of political intervention doesn't have to be formal colonization, but there can be plantation colonies, offshore bases, formal colonies, and so on and so on. So neo-colonialism is a misleading expression because the reality is the neo is unreal, because this the form of colonialism, which we call neo-colonialism, was practiced by the Dutch in the 1600s, and by the British in India through the 1700s, and by the British and French in Latin America through the 1800s, and by the British and French in Eastern Europe in 1918 to 1939. So finally, because I'm running longer than I meant to, just to jump to the present. Is China imperialist? Well, actually, yes, China is not fully imperialist, but it's absolutely on the cusp of being an imperialist power. It can be considered as analogous to Germany in the late 19th century. It's immediately in competition for the ability. It's investing heavily overseas. It has its own financial structure, partially, as yet not wholly independent of the United States, but potentially independent of the United States. It has the military capability, subject to the fact that the United States has power relative to it, to coerce colonial countries to operate the same thing. It's beginning to get the network of foreign bases in Sri Lanka, in Balochistan, in etc., etc. So China is well on the way to becoming an imperialist power, though it's sort of ambiguous because it's also still got a large chunk of classic Stalinist Soviet-style industry in its existence, and that's reflected in the fact that the character of Chinese working class politics continues to be like the character of Soviet working class politics, that is, appeal to good bureaucrats against bad bureaucrats and corruption scandals. Russia is not an imperialist power. It's a middle rank economy, but there's a but. And the but is, in order to win in Ukraine, Russia will need to have to redevelop its independent arms manufacturing capability, but also to develop a financial sector capable of operating independently of the dollar financial system. And my personal opinion, I think it's actually unlikely that Russia will win in Ukraine. But if Russia wins in Ukraine, then just as if we look at Japan in the early 20th century, if Japan had lost in the Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s, Japan would have been a nothing. It acquired a colony. If Japan had lost in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, Japan would have been colonized by Russia. But in fact, Russia was defeated and Japan breaks through and comes out as an imperialist power and acquires, in short order, Taiwan and Korea as colonies, and in due course engages in colonializing operations in China. So therefore, if Russia wins in Ukraine, what it will have to do in order to win in Ukraine will be to transform itself into something which can only survive as an imperialist power. And in that sense, Russia, if it wins in Ukraine, will be driven in the direction of Japan in the early 20th century, or for that matter, of China, of Italy in the early 20th century, which is driven by its unification on a capitalist basis to embark on overseas colonialism in Libya and elsewhere. My one other thing, I guess, is I said the supply. I missed out something. The thing which the colonial country supplies may be raw materials. It may be manufactured goods. It may also be people. There's an interesting book whose author and title I've regrettably forgotten at the moment about migration as colonialism, because what's being done is to make the migrant supplier countries pay the training and education and training costs for skilled labor, which is then exported to the United States, to Britain, to France, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that's of some use to comrades.
Thank you very much. Huge subject, as we said at the beginning. Comrades got their hands up already, so I'll bring you in a second. Couple of questions, though, first, to get the ball rolling. Comrades, if you have questions or comments, please click raise hand. You touched on Russia and China there at the end, and I think you're making good arguments there, explaining why you think China is very much on the cusp of becoming an imperialist country, which has a lot, of course, to do with the Ukraine war that you've been touching on, and the fact that the US is quite so keen to use the Russia-Ukraine war as a proxy war against China. How do you see this developing? Is it a strategy of keeping, telling China, watch what we're doing with Russia, we're going to do something similar to you? Is it more about breaking up Russia, breaking up the area around China, and fencing it, putting up a fence around it and strangling China? Could there be a situation where China and the US both exist as imperialist powers? Or is it a reflection of US imperialism going down and China going up? So something has to happen. They couldn't coexist. And related to that, we'll get to that with Yasmin Matha on the BRICS. But of course, China is also part, and Russia part of this BRICS, whatever you want to call it. It's supposed to be an alternative to US imperialism. Does China have an interest into actually doing a deal with other BRICS countries like Russia, and like countries who are so far from becoming any imperialist power? There's India, there's all sorts of, there's much smaller countries that have now joined. Is it just a sort of way to prop up Chinese imperialism, or is it something entirely different? Is it a political game, more or less? Do you want to answer this first, or do you want to have some more questions?
I think probably have a couple more.
Okay. Okay. I'm bringing in Tony first. Tony, if you could switch on your camera. Lots of people have their hands up already, which is good. Try and keep your comments brief, comrades, if you could, so we can allow people to speak. Tony, if you could switch on your camera.
Yeah. Okay, you can see me now.
Yep.
Thank you, Mike, for a very rich lecture indeed. I won't even attempt to counter most parts of it, except to say the question which, if you like, hung over me throughout is, how relevant is this to today's situation? and how compatible and consonant is it, the early history of imperialism, with what we see now, which is the overwhelming military domination of the United States in conjunction with Europe, Britain, etc. And that is, of course, the context in which many people look to China and Russia and so on. I also have to say, I do think there are distinctive periods in the formation of colonialism. You mentioned the Genoese and other early empires and their use of slave labor. Well, of course, that was true of Dutch, America, and Britain. But you will also know that Britain was amongst the first, if not the first, to abolish first the slave trade and then slavery. And then it waged a war against slavery. So to my mind, there was also not only a political but an economic impetus to that in terms of development of a market. And as long as you have slaves, you don't have a market. And Britain had an interest in enforcing that against other powers. Of course, it took about 60 or so years. I think Brazil was the last major country to abolish slavery. You mentioned, and I'm really throwing these things out at random, India, I mean, which was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. In a sense, our wealth was based on India. We extracted all the wealth that we could. We deindustrialized it, as you noted, with the abolition of tariffs, so that whereas there was loom production in India to begin with, it was transferred to Manchester. And we did that quite deliberately. We also, of course, played a divide and rule card with the Indian census. And then I think it was the Minto-Morley reforms in 1909, which divided India into communal electorates and then divided the national movement as a whole. So you might have something to say about that. But India was clearly the place where we funded our own imperial adventures abroad via things like the Cornwallis's permanent settlement. You mentioned neo-colonialism. I mean, I think it's quite straightforward, really, isn't it? That under a traditional colony, there was no political independence for the colony. But with the gaining of independence, they had a flag, they had their own rulers, but economic relationships remained very much the same. And as you say, one of jumping on again, you mentioned the different forms of imperialism, including the export of people. Of course, that was a very important part for British imperialism. There was a whole debate by people like Gibbon Wakefield, for example, and we did deliberately support the Malthusian idea that you get rid of your surplus unfit people who would then colonize in South Africa and various other of the white dominions. So I mean, all of that was bound up with each other. But if I come to your last point, you say if Russia wins in Ukraine, well, at the moment Russia is winning, but I'm not sure what winning will be like apart from Russia taking over the whole of Ukraine, which I think is highly unlikely. It's certainly on the road to taking over the Russian-speaking eastern provinces, but the question is what a victory would be like and what impact it would have. And really one final question. You stated there's always a need for one world reserve currency, and as you know, BRICS and others are challenging the domination of the dollar by which the United States is able to fund its expansion. I'm not at all sure why there is a need for one world reserve currency. So I'd be grateful for an explanation. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Mike, you better come in now. There's loads of questions already.
Okay, quite a lot. Tina, are they trying to build a fence around China or to strangle China, or is it a warning to China? My understanding is that they're trying to build a fence around China, and that I've said this, it's a sort of strange thing in a sense to say, but that in essence, if we look at the run up to 1914, what is characteristic of the run up to 1914 is the aggressive encirclement of Germany by new alliance systems involving Britain, and particular effort to prevent, for example, the Berlin to Baghdad railway, to cut off the potential alliance between Germany and Turkey. And cutting off the potential alliance between Germany and Turkey means that the British state and the French state, which it's allied with, sponsor the Serbian state in running terrorist operations, which at the end of the day kicks off the First World War. Yeah. So that exactly the opposite, far from it being the case that Germany as the rising challenger power is forced into aggression, is bound to be aggressive. It's actually that Britain as the declining power is forced to pursue an aggressive policy in relation to the rising powers. And that aggressive policy is an aggressive policy which is designed to force the other side into the appearance of being the aggressor. And essentially, the United States is pursuing the same policy in relation to China, because it's simultaneous not only Ukraine. If the United States wins in Ukraine, which I think is by far the most likely circumstance, the result will be regime change in Moscow, a new Yeltsin, i.e. a new person with willing to directly subordinate Russia to the United States. And as a result of that, the breakup of the Russian Federation, which has been advocated since Brzezinski. And indeed, actually, was the British made plans. They expected to smash the Bolsheviks, and the British made plans in the expectation of smashing the Bolsheviks, of breaking up the Tsarist Empire into much smaller and more manageable territories. Yeah. So yeah, the effect of that is to cut off oil and gas supplies from Russia to China, which Eric Kurilla, who's the commander, was the commander of CENTCOM, of the American Central Command, says which covers the Middle East, says of the Middle East, in CENTCOM we have our hands on the throat of the Chinese.
Oh, hi there, Tony. Yeah, I'm just checking. I've only just got back to my base at work. Do you want me?
Have our hands on the throat of the Chinese economy, says Kurilla. This is in published testimony to the US Senate. And it's not particularly original to me. This was the argument of the guys that this was essentially, that 1914 was essentially about a war to protect British hegemony by way of Britain cutting off and encircling Germany, was essentially the argument of Parvus and Heinrich Kuno and their associates in the Die Glocke tendency. Now, I think that Parvus and Kuno and Die Glocke and the Die Glocke guys made a fundamental mistake, which was that they saw correctly what was going on, that this war was about the decline of British imperialism and British imperialist responses to the decline of British imperialism, but then they bet the future of the workers' movement on German victory, which was never likely, and it involved them subordinating the workers' movement to the Kaiser regime. So that they end up as a nothing. All of these guys, they don't even wind up having significant presence in the right-wing social democracy after the war, because they made the wrong bet. Tony, American military dominance. Britain before 1929 adopted a policy that the British Navy should be strong enough to fight any two fleets together. And it was indeed strong enough to fight any two fleets together. And the British did not need the French in order to impose a total blockade on Germany and nearly starve Germany to death in 1914-18. And indeed, David Edgerton, in his book on, oh God, British Nation, the British War Machine, makes clear that although we talk in the ideology, we talk about Little Britain standing alone in 1940, the reality was this is Britain, Canada, Australia, India, etc., all the British colonies in Africa, South Africa, all the British colonies in Africa, against Germany and Italy. The British had to succumb to the Americans taking over because the collapse of France and Norway meant that they couldn't maintain the strategic position of keeping Europe divided. Was British policy to keep Europe divided consistently from 1714 through to 1940. So in relation to the other one side of it is that there's a tendency to underestimate the strength of the British Empire before 1914. The world dominance of the British Empire before 1914. The other side of it is, we say, Tony, you say America together with the Europeans. Well, yes, together with the Europeans, but the Europeans are totally trivial. That when Sarkozy and Cameron tried to conduct an independent military operation in Libya, it collapsed. They couldn't do it. The operation had to be taken over by the Americans. So the military capability of the Europeans adds virtually nothing to the military capability of the Americans. Now, it's certainly the case that the idea of China being an immediate challenger to the United States, in the same sense that America was an immediate challenger to Britain, is illusory. On the other hand, China could be a challenger to the United States in the same way that Germany was a challenger to Britain. That is to say that although it was not strong enough to take over as a substitute world hegemon, it was nonetheless strong enough to fight the British, to force the British to bring the Americans on board. And the Ukraine war is a tactic of the United States in this context, that is to say that it forces the Europeans to participate in the war. If the United States started a war with China over the South China Sea or Taiwan without having previously forced the Europeans into involvement in the war, then the Europeans could pursue the policy that the British pursued in 1703 to 1714, which is to fight the war on Dutch and German territory, or that the Americans pursued in 1914-18, which is to sell arms to the British and French, but keep out of the war until 2 years had passed, which the Americans repeated in 1939-45, to sell arms to the British and French and get the British deeply into their debt, but keep out of the war and their own tax operations for a year and a half into the war. The Europeans said that if the United States had gone to war in the Pacific without starting the war in Ukraine, the European powers could have sat it out and supplied arms to the United States and strengthened their own arms industries, strengthened their own capabilities until such time as it became clear that in order to defeat the Chinese, that it was necessary for the Europeans to come on board. They haven't been able to do that. On the contrary, the United States is primarily insisting on the Europeans drawing down their own military stocks, on breaking the European economies through insisting on sanctions against Russia. The setting up, this is a policy for the new American century. Ukraine is more than anything else a policy for the new American century through keeping France and Germany in radical subordination to the United States. The last countries to abolish slavery, Saudi still has domestic slavery. China continued to have domestic slavery until the Communist Revolution in 1948. Okay, plantation slavery, that goes with the American Civil War and with the emancipation in Brazil. Now, but plantation slavery, I don't think it's right to think of plantation slavery as a pre-capitalist social form. Arkwright, who operated the textile mills in Derbyshire, bought his workforce as indentured apprentices who were orphans from the City of London. The City of London sold these guys, these kids, to Arkwright to work in his mills. So that this phenomenon of forced labor in the transition to capitalism is not just a matter of the colonial world, but also of the development of British capitalism, and of the development of capitalism under the integument of Stalinism. The Russian development is not state capitalism. That's utterly misleading conception, but it has a dynamic towards capitalism, and that dynamic towards capitalism is visible in the Gulag as an institution of forced labor, which is analogous to the second serfdom, but is also analogous to plantation slavery. Export of people. Now, this is something where it's a rather different thing. My point is that the colonial powers are being compelled, colonial countries are being compelled to export people to the imperialist countries. But what Tony was referring to was that the imperialist countries, in order to create the colonial regimes, exported people on a very large scale, and not just in the lower classes, but also in the middle classes. My own ancestors, one of them went to Calcutta and made a fortune at the Calcutta bar, came back to Wales and spent it building a pompous house and standing for elections to Parliament unsuccessfully, and had to go back to Calcutta, where he wrote a whinging pamphlet about why Indians shouldn't be permitted the right of audience in the high courts in Calcutta. But just that all over. Now, the absence of this colonialist export of people, except for the case of Israel-Palestine, is a symptom, in my view, of the decline of capitalism. The United States is unable to, and Britain is unable to, make conditions bad enough for the working class and the middle classes to induce people to go off and do settlement elsewhere. And that's an important fact, because it means that the classic forms of colonialism aren't going to work. Why one reserve currency? The answer is because international trade requires there to be some common, the integration of production internationally, which already exists from the late Middle Ages, requires there to be permanent large-scale international trade, and the permanent large-scale international trade requires there to be, just as trade as such requires money as a measure of equivalence, international trade requires international money as a measure of equivalence. And so there is no capitalist trade regime which doesn't include, there's foreign exchange, elaborate foreign exchange stuff in the Middle Ages, but there's always one, at the end of the day, money of liquidity. That's it.
Thank you, comrade. We've got about 6 others with their hands up now, so we have to try and force it into a bit smaller sections, please. John and Steve first.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks, Mike. I heard what you just said about the not considering the plantation economy as separate from capitalism, and the book that I'm just finishing at the moment would certainly more than support that. What I find difficult is that you and Tony, or maybe it's Tony more than you, seem to be arguing that India, not the Caribbean, actually enabled the further development of a capitalist imperialism, the expansion of the British Empire, the full development of capitalism. Because my understanding is quite different, that it was that plantation economy, particularly around sugar, which created new domestic demands for consumer goods in Britain and in Europe and in North America, which set in motion a form of coerced labor, which wasn't that unusual, because children were a form of coerced labor at that same time, conventionally, certainly in Britain. Also, it was necessary for the British state to intervene and create the financial institutions and the financial instruments whereby the flow of capital into the Caribbean and out of the Caribbean could be facilitated. And also the export of cotton forced the development of more mechanized, more factory-based, more innovative ways of producing cotton goods, linen goods, woolen goods, etc., etc. So on many levels, not just the Industrial Revolution, but the development of modern capitalism, the way that financial capitalism operates, very much came from what Britain was doing in the Caribbean. And in fact, the development of capitalist relations in the northern states of the USA as well flowed from that. And this was at a time before the cotton industry in the southern states of the USA had really taken off at all, which wasn't a phenomenon really until the 19th century, whereas the Caribbean had been fully functioning as a slave-based, plantation-based economy. And the final thing is that the actual sugar production system itself demanded the production of a whole load of metal goods, which in turn hastened the development of metal industries in the West Midlands in particular, where I'm from, and in other parts of the country as well. Yes, India played a part, but it was the Caribbean which changed the British cotton industry so that it could displace the Indian cotton industry. It wasn't a straightforward move from an Indian cotton industry to an industry based around Lancashire. That didn't happen. Were it not been for the Caribbean producing a lot of cotton, then that could not have happened. It could not have developed the machinery, the innovative methods, the tool making, etc., to enable the mass production of cotton and other fabrics. So I think that you seem to be saying some of the same thing as I've just said, but also at the same time arguing that the Indian Empire was the fountain of the greater expansion of the British Empire and of modern capitalism, whereas I don't see it. I think that played a significant but a minor role.
Thank you. Steve, please.
Hi, Mike. Thank you very much for that talk. It's very interesting. Very.
Oh, sorry, not you, Steve Freeman.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Steve Lee.
Hi, yeah, Steve Lee from Firebrand Communists in the U.S. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Really, really, really interesting. I have some questions. Do you think that the need for formal colonies by European powers, etc., in Africa and so forth, was necessitated by the need to impose the capitalist mode of production on areas that in pre-capitalist, and once the capitalist mode of production was established in the colonies, they no longer needed the formal political control to maintain their control. That's one question. The other question is Lenin's theory of the aristocracy of labor. Do you think that was a? I mean, I'll just say what I think, and you can tweet it. Anyway, I think it was an unnecessary. It was an unnecessary addition to the theory, and that Marx had already said that the ruling ideas of any age are the ideas of the ruling class. I think that alone explains the adherence of the socialist parties and much of the working class to the war. You don't need to posit an aristocracy of labor theory. I just want to see what you thought about that. And the question on China is, what makes China not yet imperialist, even though you say it's heading towards imperialism? And then on Russia, even if Russia is not imperialist, which I disagree with, but anyway, even if that is true, does that mean that the working class still needs to oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine anyway, even if it's not an imperialist power? Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Ben, and then I'm going to bring Mike back in.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
I'd like to thank Mike for a brilliant conspectus of history and theory. But to be more pointed, I understood about 20 minutes before the end of his talk, Mike seemed to state categorically that in the event of a Russian victory, while admitting all the time that the concept of a complete Russian victory in Ukraine was pretty hard to pin down, but in the event of a Russian victory by any criterion, Russia would in a sense be compelled to become an imperialist power in a more or less traditional sense. A few moments later, Mike rightly went on to remind us of the Zbigniew Brzezinski plan, not to mention the Hermann Goering plan of splitting Russia up into bite-sized chunks. Now, it seems to me that this in a way moves Mike into a rather odd political position. That is, that the resistance of the area and the state of the Russian Federation is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. And I'd like Mike to be a bit more specific about the paths or pathways through which he envisages a victorious Russian state of being, if you like, doomed to fight for a place in the imperialist ladder which I'm not quite sure what divides states fighting up the imperialist ladder or resisting their descent from other states fighting for what I'll dare to call national independence, independence perhaps including the near abroad, including perhaps those just outside the near abroad states with big actually by now, since the 1940s, indigenous big Russophone minorities which are currently oppressed, certainly in the Baltics. So adding that into the mix, I'd like to hear Mike sketching out the route maps or the criteria for route maps of the perhaps inevitable path of a victorious Russian state, victorious in the Ukraine war, as distinct from a surrender to the Goering-Brzezinski plan. Thank you.
Mike, do you want somebody else, or do you want to answer now?
I think I'd better come back in now.
Yes.
Yeah. Quickly to John Tumman. I'm not saying that the British Empire in India is the source of all the Industrial Revolution, etc. I don't think that the Caribbean colonial regime is on its own either. I think we have to, helpful to the Caribbean, Joseph Inikori's book, not just Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, but more recently Joseph Inikori's book, Africans and the Industrial Revolution, on the slave trade. Because, of course, actually the other thing which was going on was a big scale is the Asiento from 1713, and British the primary shippers of slave population into Latin America were the British under the Asiento through from 1713 onwards. So it's not just. Secondly, we've got tea alongside in the tea trade and the opium trade into China in the 19th century, but beginning earlier. Holly Brewer's book, Holly Brewer's article, Creating a Common Law of Slavery, is of some interest in relation to the Royal African Company of Charles II and James II and its relationships with the Glorious Revolution and so on. Maria Fusaro's work shows that just as China uses the hukou to undercut rival industrial production by essentially the employer promises a bonus at the end of the year, but then before the end of the year informs the urban immigration police, and they get workers deported back to their villages and don't receive the bonus. So under the doctrine in Cutter and Powell, if you made a contract in London to be paid a bonus when the ship returned to London, to be paid subsistence while the ship was at sea, and then a lump sum when the ship returned to London, you weren't entitled to claim if the ship never returned to London, and the employer would just leave the ship in the Mediterranean, and the workers would be paid their subsistence while the ship was at sea, but when it wasn't at sea would be dumped on the welfare systems of Venice, Livorno, Beirut, etc., with the result that there's a lot of diplomatic pressure on the British state over this. But in addition, the British merchant shipping industry undercuts the Dutch and takes over the Mediterranean shipping trade. Yeah. And the British equally, 1689 to 1713, the British become the major suppliers of cannon by virtue of innovations in iron founding, which subsequently become the basis of steam engines, etc., because finding iron cannon on large scales. The arms industry, I can't remember the woman's name, Priya Satia, has written at length on the Birmingham arms industry as a driver of the industry. So I don't think it's just, we can't just say it's just in India, it's just the Caribbean, it's a whole complex of the war state. Then the second thing about that, what I'm saying is not that the empire in India is the product, capitalism is a product of the empire in India. What I'm saying is that territorial colonialism, and this relates to Steve Lee's point, territorial colonialism is the product of the empire in India. You know, that the empire in India, by excluding the French, also first it drives the East India Company to take bits of to fight with the French over Egypt, to take bits of the Gulf, to take Malaysia, to take Burma, etc., and then and indeed it's together with the East India Company, it's the East India Company which boots the Dutch out of Sri Lanka and out of South Africa, out of the Cape Colony. So that the protectionism of the Indian Empire results in other European powers being forced to construct territorial empires. It's not capitalist imperialism. Capitalist imperialism can function perfectly well with puppet regimes. I think there's no reason to suppose that it could function with couldn't function with puppet regimes. One can perfectly well imagine an Iroquois puppet regime in North America or a Zulu puppet regime in South Africa, or whatever the hell it might be. It can function perfectly well with puppet regimes. Territorial conquest is the result of Anglo-French conflict, that particular phenomenon. Lenin on the labor aristocracy, I agree, it's unnecessary and actually unproductive. But the point is, what he's trying to do is to escape from Bukharin's argument for anti-statism. Bukharin argues, as long as you remain loyal to the idea of taking over the state, and Lenin actually, just before he writes the Letters from Afar, and as a result of that, State and Revolution, he writes actually a polemic against Bukharin in favor of Kautsky on the state, which he abandons shortly afterwards as a result of then going back and reading Marx and Engels on the state. So I just think in terms of that, but it is also the case, it's not just Lenin, it's Engels says Britain exploits the whole world, and therefore naturally Britain has a bourgeois working class as well as a bourgeois bourgeoisie and a bourgeois aristocracy. I think it's Lenin, that's Engels and not Marx. Ben, I think it's a damnatio. It's a horrendous set of political choices. I think that socialists, that communists in Russia would need to be opposing Russian holding Ukraine in subordination, Russian holding Georgia in subordination, which is going on right at the moment, and so on and so forth. But our responsibility as communists in Britain and in the United States, etc., is primarily to oppose the aggressive war which is being fought and has been being fought. That the Maidan movement in 2014 was an orchestrated color revolution, orchestrated and controlled from beginning to end by United States security forces. And so our responsibility, just as the primary responsibility of British socialists in the First World War was to oppose the Brits, even though we weren't enthusiasts for the Kaiser. And so equally, the primary responsibility of German socialists in the First World War was to oppose the Kaiser regime, even though actually British conquest, as we saw in 18 to 1939, British conquest was pretty fucking disastrous for Germany. Look behind, a level behind that, 1688, I said this before, 1688 is a full-scale Dutch military invasion of England. 1640 is a Scots invasion of England, which then forces the king to the negotiating table, which enables the revolution to take place. 1775, the Americans joined the old enemy, France, against Britain in order to fight off the restored Tory regime in London. That sort of level of, you can't be opposed to, you can't really seek the overthrow of your own state without actually being willing to see its military defeat in the right circumstances. That's it.
Thank you. We've got Steve Freeman now.
Unmute myself. There we go. Hi, Mike. I'll start again now. Thank you very much, Mike, for the talk. It's very, very informative. My takeaways from what you said, I think, are the following. Well, first of all, I think it's important to, is state X, whoever X may be, an imperialist power, yes or no? And I think you're right to say that's not totally the right question. Is it becoming? What is the transition? That's what we have to talk about as Marxists. In other words, how is it evolving? Is it the rise and fall of an imperialist power? Who's the rising power? Who's the falling power? As well as simply going, that's an imperialist power, this one's not, because everything obviously is in motion. So that was my first takeaway. My second takeaway was, I think you're absolutely right to, well, we'll come back to this in a minute, but I think what was also good was to think about imperialism as existing in the way you set it out prior to capitalism. So we are thinking of Roman imperialism, we are thinking of feudal imperialism, if I've understood that correctly. And then, of course, we're talking about capitalist imperialism as a concept, and we're talking about the political economy of capitalist imperialism. So I suppose that capitalist imperialism is characterized by the fact that it's all to do, really, at the end of the day, with the employment of wage labor. How many workers does America employ? And obviously, it employs a lot of workers in America, but obviously, it's extracting surplus value from people employed by American companies all over the world. I couldn't count those up. The Chinese have got a lot of wage workers as well. You know what I mean? So we can look at that, the extraction of surplus value, and the idea that under capitalism, you must expand or die. You are driven by the logic of capital to expand. And it's because of that logic of expansion that different capitalist states come into conflict with each other, it seems to me. That's the logic of capitalist imperialism. And then I think it's right to say that what imperialism does, it divides states into oppressor and oppressed states and nations. I think that's a very important decision, a very important point. And oppressor states, we're really talking about oppressor states, the political and military aspect of it. Who's got military power? Who's got the arms industries? Who's got the nuclear weapons, which we haven't really mentioned yet, and so on, which seems to me to become an imperialist power, you must have those sorts of things. And then my final point was we also perhaps should think about regional imperialist powers, and other powers which aren't world imperialist powers. Like you might look at Israel, Saudi Arabia, you might look at India, who you might say are not world imperialist powers, but they are very powerful in their regions because they are waging struggles in their particular regions and moving around. So I think there's the idea of sub-imperialist powers, regional imperialist powers. I think that's got to be, in other words, it's a complicated picture, and it's more than just one world power versus everybody else. I think it's a much more mixed picture of rising and falling powers, of new powers arriving, and so on. I'll finish there.
Thanks, Steve. Matthew.
Thanks, comrades. If I can unmute. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think there's a few things. I mean, obviously, this is deeply complicated. We've gone for days. But just to throw out a few points, I think there's a few, in these terms, what we're looking at, of course, now is the decline and fall of the US empire. It's an interesting time, but it could result in billions of people getting killed if we're unlucky. The thing is also what you say in terms of, the issuance of the world currency. I mean, the power able to be hegemon and issue the currency, of course, is granted this vast advantage over everybody else, because obviously then they can issue as much debt as they like and as much currency as they like, more or less. Effectively, it serves as another form of taxation on the rest of the world in favour of the hegemon. The other bits I think also is in terms of development, both of what we're now looking at is a really decayed form of finance capital, in which now we have effectively all the world's major banks are effectively a single organism, extraordinary, and it can't be touched, because if any part of it goes down, then the whole lot can come apart, and it all has to be guaranteed by the state. After 2007-8, so it's a very, very odd time. In terms of the Chinese, I agree in terms of obviously they operate in as a sort of a rising sort of semi-imperialist power, but with some odd characteristics. I mean, the state still controls large chunks of the Chinese economy. It was able to resuscitate effectively world capitalism, which is a function, I think, of Stalinism in the post-Second World War period, is to resuscitate capitalism whenever it gets into shit, by running this enormous building splurge. I mean, they actually laid down more concrete than has ever been seen in human history. And it's that actually revives, from the depths, the rest of the world's capitalist economies. So in those terms, it's different. The other thing, of course, is that of course there was a deal between the Chinese and the Americans. Very obviously, Nixon, being a crook but being a very clever crook, actually went out of his way to do a deal with the Chinese in the early 70s, and this, of course, lasted. I mean, there was a whole series of quite deep discussions and so on and so forth, going over 20 some odd years between the Chinese and the Americans, and this broke up, I suspect, at the point that the Chinese said, well, no, we won't allow you to start running our economy, or have it, we will maintain control, this is ours. And at some point they said, okay, the Americans decided that this was their. I mean, clearly now, of course, it's very obvious, because the Chinese, of course, have been the world's largest manufacturing country since 2012, and now, in those terms, are twice the size and twice as much manufacturing output as the US, which does not mean that the US is not still the world's key economy, but in no terms of those indicators, that's the case. And it's also, of course, you do have this evolution of monopoly as well. I mean, in fact, you're now getting to the position where some key things actually rely on a single company or a single factory in all of the world, and that's new. I mean, if you look at, the key point of there's a few key points of particularly sharp conflict between the US and the Chinese. One, of course, is semiconductors. Now, machines to make the highest grade of semiconductor are actually manufactured by one company in the Netherlands. And the Americans have said to them, you cannot, under any circumstances, give any of these to anybody who might give them to the Chinese, or allow Chinese or anybody, or any of their agents, to buy these things. The customer of that company are in fact another company called the Taiwan Semiconductor, which actually manufactures all of these. There's nobody else that actually does this, and the key to high-end semiconductor manufacture is the single island of Taiwan, and this also has caused great paranoia in the US. The other thing, of course, is the Chinese now, of course, dominate large sections of the manufacture of key things like rare earth metals, which are entirely refinable in China. There's nowhere else is done. Lithium, virtually all done in China. You know, things like photovoltaic cells, virtually all manufactured in China, virtually nowhere else. You know, so in those terms, you see this sort of, you know, it breaks down in those, and you can see this in terms of what Biden has done in his effort to with the CHIPS Act and so on, to pump more and more money into the US economy and say, well, can we break down some of this monopoly, which of course they will fail. The other thing, of course, is that actually, in fact, the one thing we should say is that the Ukrainians have lost. It's quite clear they've lost. You know, they said they'd fight to the last Ukrainian. We can see the last Ukrainian. They've lost. They can't. They're currently trying to recruit more Ukrainians or force more Ukrainians into the trenches, and the ones they've got are running away. In many cases, they're refusing to go back for reasonable things. Like, why should we get killed for these guys? And as you say, I think also the other thing you talk about, you know, this impact on Europe, which has not really been fully, explored in terms of the fact that, you know, the key energy supply from Russia to Germany was blown up by the Americans, and the Europeans have been so frightened they've not said a word about it, barely a word. You know, and certainly not the governments. I mean, Tina points out obviously some
Wind up now, comrade. Sorry.
Some of the German political parties, but the German government's not uttered a word that its critical energy supply has been destroyed deliberately by the Americans. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew. It's 8:45. We've got two more people with their hand up. Can I urge you to be short, please, comrades? We do try to finish by 9 p.m. Diana.
Okay. I would echo Matthew and Tony's disagreement with Mike about Russia losing. But a point I found of Mike's that I found interesting was it saying that Russia's arms manufacture, or I can't remember exactly what he said, but about manufacturing needing to be the capitalist model. In fact, it's totally the opposite. Russia has been, I mean, Russia's economy was devastated and privatized with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But what's been happening since 2014, and particularly recently since the start of the SMO, is that Russia has been taking its arms manufacture more and more under public ownership and control. It's a progressive act, and Russia. Part of the reason why Russia is winning against that NATO's proxy war is because it can manufacture at a higher rate than the US and NATO countries, particularly the US, which has the neoliberal capitalism and the corporations, so very, very privatized, doing everything for profit, churning out rubbish that doesn't work for greater and greater levels of profit, while Russia is churning out stuff that works to actually use. And that was the main point I wanted to make. If short of time, maybe I won't say anything else.
Thank you, Diana. Sorry, Sandy, please.
I disagreed with Mike's comparison of the dominance of the British imperialism in the 19th century and the American dominance in the latter part of the 20th century. I think America is far more dominant, to the point that you could really say that there is only one imperialist power, the USA, and the other powers such as Britain, France, Japan are subordinate vassals of American imperialism. America is the imperialist power, and we can also say, I think, it's the last imperialist power. I don't think we have to worry about China or Russia becoming imperialist. This is a situation that we've now got with the nuclear-armed world and global warming, etc. We're in the last phase. Either the world's working class moves forward and ends imperialism and institutes workers' power, or we've had it. So I think that the struggle against US imperialism is absolutely central to communist politics. I disagree where it might seem to say at one point we're the defeat of our own ruling class in war, but we're not for the victory of the other side. I think in situations where nations are fighting for national sovereignty, we should be for their victory. We are for the victory of the Palestinian people. We are for the victory of the Iranian people if attacked by imperialism. And the most important, we are for the victory of the Russian people in its fight against domination by US imperialism, who has, as Mike says, the plan to dominate and break up the Russian Federation, which would be a big blow to the international working class. So I think it's important for communists that we are on the side of the global south, on the people that are fighting imperialism, and that if imperialism, US imperialism is weakened, it's a big boost for the working class internationally, because anywhere the working class gets near to taking power or takes power, the US is the enemy. And that is the enemy that we have to overcome. And we have to be willing to make alliances with those fighting against the US imperialism, which is obviously the aggressor. If you look at what's happened in Ukraine, US is behind that. They're the aggressor. They're aggressor against China. They're aggressor against the Palestinians. They're the aggressor against Iran. USA is aggressor, not the Russians. And I think the left, a lot of the left, has just been a disgrace in terms of the situation in Ukraine. And I think it's very important, if we're trying to organize a communist whole regroupment of communists, we have to situate as imperialism as the main enemy, and we have to fight with those that are resisting imperialism and fighting for national sovereignty. In terms, just the last point, I mean, part of the US domination is the domination of the dollar. And obviously in 1971, when Nixon ended gold convertibility, was really important. And as Hudson says, I don't know if you've read his work, that allowed the Americans then basically to print money that the rest of the world has to recognize, and we end up subsidizing the states by doing so. So that itself it is a development of imperialism, I would say, from 71 on, and it is certainly the dominant power. So that would be the points that we want to make.
Thank you, Sandy. Comrades, there's been a lot of questions and disagreements. Tony's got his hand up again, but it's 7 minutes to 9, and we really can't. We have to finish around 9-ish, but though I do get a feeling Mike might be longer than that. Over to you, Mike.
Okay. A Tony point, but also Tony in the chat, but also Steve Freeman. It's fundamental. The word imperialism goes back to the word imperialism is modern, is 19th century, but the word empire and imperial goes back to ancient Rome. Yeah, true. And it's there in the Middle Ages, but it means something radically different in ancient Rome from what it means in the Middle Ages, and it means something radically different in the Middle Ages from what it means when it's revived in the 19th century. And it is not actually, there's a book by a woman called Kathleen Wilson, The Sense of the People, which is about the idea of imperialism in Britain in the 1730s. So that the idea is around, it's just the ism stuff. Okay, but then the fundamental question is, what is the political economy dynamics which produce radical inequality between states and peoples, and which produce the recurrent production of world hegemon states? And I have to say, Sandy, I think you underestimate the power of the UK in the pre-1914 regime and the malignity of the UK in its its use of the Confederacy to control the American of the southern cotton states to control the American colonies, the malignity of the UK and its operations in Latin America, the malignity of the UK in relation to the extraterritoriality for Europeans in Turkey and the etc., 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 etc. But what is causing these dynamics, which are not dynamics, the word imperialism in the Middle Ages is about a political, the empire, advocacy of the empire is about a political orientation, and the form of colonialism, which occurs as a result of English movement into Scotland and Wales, does not create a radical subordination of the Scots or the Welsh economy to the English economy. It's capitalist imperialism. It's the specific characteristics of capitalist imperialism which produce the phenomenon which is misdescribed as the quote law of uneven development. This is a law not of development in general, law of uneven and combined development for that matter. It's a law of capitalism that produces that. There are, secondly, there's a hierarchy of states. And yes, there are states whose economy is colonized by states higher up the hierarchy, but colonizes states lower down the hierarchy. Tsarist Russia is the clearest example of that, in fact. The Russian economy was unambiguously colonized in the interests of Britain and France in the pre-1914 situation, but equally unambiguously colonized Kazakhstan, etc., etc., etc. So there are middle rank. Similarly, Portugal was an imperialist power in a classic sense, except that you've got this bizarre division of labor where the naval work is done by Portugal and the financial work is done by Genoa. And the work is done by the poor bloody African slaves on Guinea-Bissau and the offshore Atlantic islands and so on. Israel is different matter because Israel is quite plainly just a settler colony of the United States. Israel stands in the same relationship to the United States that Canada stood in relation to, or Australia stood in relation to Britain. Okay, Moshe will correct me on this because Israel has had a historical relationship with Britain and a historical relationship with France, but it's clearly the case now that it depends on continuous and continued resupply of arms by the United States and on systematic discrimination by the United States. Comrade Tuman raised the question, I'm wrong about India because of non-protectionism, but I'm not saying that there were tariffs protecting British interests in India. I'm saying there were non-tariff barriers, regulatory barriers, which made it difficult for the French industry or German industry to sell into East India Company controlled India and subsequently into British controlled India. I don't believe in my opinion, that free trade is a mercantilist policy. Free trade is a mercantilist policy in the interests of a world dominant power. In the 19th century, a mercantilist policy in the interests of British access. When Grotius wrote Mare Liberum demanding free trade, it was Dutch interests. When the United States start talking about free trade in the later 20th century, it's US interests. But in reality, actually, the United States similarly has never ceased to be a mercantilist, has never ceased to operate. It calls them sanctions as often as not. But in reality, what's going on is protection of US industry by non-tariff barriers. that I think is all I'm really going to say, because although there's a whole load of, obviously, that we disagree, we have disagreements about Ukraine and Russia. I see what I see is stalemated fronts. The Russians have failed to achieve the original objective of taking Kiev and knocking them out or forcing a surrender. Was defeated. And it was defeated basically because Donald Trump, in spite of talking up friendliness with the Putin administration, in fact supplied vast quantities of anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons to the Ukrainians, which meant that the Russians could not deliver the knockout blow which they delivered to Georgia in 2008. And what's going on now is we have stalemated fronts on land, but in fact, the primary objective of the United States, insofar as it isn't to cause regime change in Moscow and thereby get US control of the territory of the Russian Federation, the primary objective is to knock out the Russian Black Sea fleet. And that objective is close to, in fact, being achieved, because in the war at sea, the war at land, the Russians are doing well. In the war at sea, NATO is largely succeeding in, and I assume it's NATO, because where the hell have the Ukrainians got naval forces from? So then I don't, I'm sort of skeptical. But the underlying question, and this is the politics of it, Parvus. Parvus and his co-thinkers, Heinrich Kuno, Max Beer, Paul, oh God, I can't remember the guy's name. There's the group in the Die Glocke tendency absolutely correctly identified that the main force of reaction in the worldwide, before 1914 was the British Empire. No doubt. And no doubt that whatever that although the British Empire declined quite considerably since 1854, but then they bet the workers' movement on the victory of Germany. And betting the workers' movement on the victory of Germany was a fucking bad bet. And it's exactly the same problem that to bet the workers' movement on the victory of Russia, or indeed the victory, for that matter, the victory of China, is a bad bet. It's making the workers' movement, it's subordinating the workers' movement to the nationalists. And China, in fact, Matthew, I think, correctly pointed to Nixon in Beijing in 1972, demonstrated clearly the untrustworthiness of the Stalinist bureaucracy to defend national interests, that its defense of national interests of the Chinese Stalinist bureaucracy led the Chinese to ally with the Americans. And by allying with the Americans, the Chinese backed the Chilean coup d'etat. They backed the terrorist Khmer Rouge against the Vietnamese. They created a situation where the Russians were forced to arm against China, and the great squeeze on the Russian military budgets, which lies at the back of Gorbachev's collapse, is partly due to Nixon in China. So the idea that we can say the defeat of the United States is the way forward is delusional. And Sandy's point that the US is the last imperialist power, yes, that's probably true. The reason is that the most likely outcome of the 21st century is generalized nuclear exchange. If the working class can break out of its managerialist delusions and its nationalist delusions and begin to reorganize itself on a world scale and confront the international regime, then there's a possibility of avoiding generalized nuclear exchange. But otherwise, yeah, generalized nuclear exchange is actually probably more likely than the global warming killing us all, to be frank. That's it. That's all I'll say. But I just throw it back to the point. At the end of the day, we need to. I may well be. It's quite likely that I'm wrong, but my 4-part long series of supplements is an attempt to tackle what the political economy questions underneath this are. Yeah, and it seems to me that getting to grips with the political economy questions is really fundamental, in spite of the fact that we have great difficulty in doing it. We have to break with the frame of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in order to set ourselves free to actually understand what the political economic dynamics actually are. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mike. Comrades, I know there are a couple of people who wanted to speak again, and there just wasn't enough time. It's such a huge subject, and I'm sure we're going to get back to it. So thank you, Mike. I'm going to distribute the articles you've shared earlier on with the video of the session, and then comrades can read up on it. But certainly a very thought-provoking session. Thank you, comrades. We'll see you next week. It was going to be possibly 2 introductions on Soviet constructivism and town planning, 1917 to 37, and USSR Stalinist symbolism and imagery. Why are they so popular again? Thank you, comrades. See you next week.
And thank you, comrades, for questions and contributions, which were stimulating and helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Bye-bye.